Hello, I'm Dr. Brian Robinson, Assistant Professor of Philosophy here in the Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy at Texas A&M University-Kingsville. I'm very happy to be giving this year's Constitution Day talk for the department. I am saddened, however, not to get to be able to be with you all in person, talk with you, and hear your questions and thoughts and have a conversation with you all. Unfortunately, there's this whole pandemic thing of which you may have heard. Funny I should mention that pandemic, though, because that, oddly enough, is part of what we'll be talking about today. So let's get down to it. Today I wanted to talk to you about plague, Plato, and propaganda, ancient lessons that we can learn for modern democracy. The first thing we want to talk about is the plague. And no, not the one currently going on, but rather one that happened a long time ago, back in ancient Athens. Now, you may know a lot about Athens back in the day of classical antiquity, or you may not. In case you don't, let's start with a short history. In 510 BCE, democracy was set up in Athens, and this was something special. At the time, democracies were not common in ancient Greece. In fact, this was the first one. Other cities had kings or oligarchies who ruled things, but Athens decided to be different. They were going to let the people be in charge. Now, when we say the people, that's severely limited. Not everybody got a vote. There were plenty of slaves. Women didn't get a vote. There was only a small portion of the population that had political power, that had the vote, that actually did the ruling. And within that, there was an even smaller group, mostly of just rich people, that actually would run for office. But it still was something different to this democracy. Now we're going to skip way ahead almost 80 years to 431. In 431, Athens with its allies go to war with Sparta and its allies. Athens and Sparta were the two great powers in Greece at the time. Sparta was the land power. They had the powerful army that was highly trained, highly disciplined, and better than anything Athens could field. Athens was the naval power. They had the best and the most ships. And so we had two sides, both very strong, but neither could give definitive battle to the other to defeat the other. But because they're the land power, Sparta brings their army up and lays siege to Athens. So the Athenians do what most people do in a siege. They bring everybody inside the walls. This, however, in the case of Athens, was disastrous, because the next year in 430, a massive plague struck. Now our source for this is Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, he himself actually contracted the plague and survived it. He describes in detail what it was like. Short answer, not pretty at all. We don't know exactly what the plague was. Epidemiologists and doctors still love to debate this from time to time. The most common answer is something like typhoid or typhus. It was incredibly deadly. Between 1/3 and 2/3 of the city were killed. People were not burned on funeral pyres as was common, but instead were left in the streets. Those who helped the others that were sick often themselves died. People who used to do evil things in secret would do them without fear in public anymore. It was devastating. The plague, in fact, in 430 was so bad that the Spartans said, "Forget this, we're out of here," and lifted their siege so that they didn't get the plague. But the suffering doesn't stop there. The next year in 429, the plague comes back again. More death. And this time, it's so bad that Pericles dies. Pericles was the leader of the Athenian people at the time, a great general and politician. As Thucydides puts it, Pericles, indeed, by his rank, ability, and known integrity, was enabled to exercise independent control over the multitude. In short, to lead them instead of being led by them. It was Pericles who said, "We can defeat Sparta." It was Pericles who said, "Hey, everybody, let's come inside the wall." It was Pericles who could rally the people to the common cause and the common good. In his funeral oration in the winter of 431 to 430, Pericles says, "Future ages will wonder at us, as the present age wonders at us now." He could grip the people and pull them together as no one else in Athens could. But Pericles was lost. As Thucydides describes it, after the Second Peloponnesian invasion, that is to say, the invasion from the Spartans. With their land devastated for the second time, and under the double burden of plague and war, the Athenians suffered a change of mind. They now began to blame Pericles for persuading them to war. Without Pericles, the people lost a voice to guide them. Others came up, mind you, but these others were something different. As Thucydides puts it, more on a level with one another, and each grasping at supremacy, they ended by committing even the conduct of state affairs to the whims of the multitude. In other words, those who sought to replace Pericles did not so much try to lead the multitude, but rather be led by them, to give the multitude what it wanted so that they could be elected, so that they could have power. Now, one of these folks is this guy right here, Alcibiades, a true rogue. And here he is talking to his friend and perhaps teacher, Socrates, whom we'll see again in a little while. One thing to note does happen the following year or the year after, and so either in 428 or 427, the philosopher Plato was born. 2 years of plague, and then shortly after, Plato was born. But it's not over yet. The next year, plague comes back again. Plague 3, the plaguening. Yet more death and despair. Now, the war continues this whole time, but it took a hiatus to some degree during all of this death, and took a while before the Athenians truly refocused on it. In 415, the Athenians, led by that guy Alcibiades, decides to invade Sicily in order to help consolidate power. If they can take over Sicily, they could then be stronger than Sparta and come back and beat Sparta. That was the plan. Alcibiades proposed this, almost certainly to get himself more power. But before the battle in Sicily could truly start, Alcibiades was recalled to Athens on what were likely trumped-up charges by his political enemies. Yet, rather than return to Athens and face the charges and defend himself, Alcibiades, no true leader of the people, defected to Sparta and helped them. Between that and the inept and bickering fighting between the leaders who took over the campaign in Sicily, and generally poor strategy, the Athenians over the period of the next 2 years were utterly destroyed in Sicily, almost to the man. This marked the beginning of the end of the war in many ways. Shortly thereafter, in 411, there was a coup, led in part by Alcibiades, to take over Athens and overthrow democracy. And this led to the reign of an oligarchy called the 400. There was much blood in the streets. This, however, was not a stable reign. The 400 couldn't agree on policies, and it quickly fell apart. So the following year, in 410, democracy was more or less restored, and the war continued. But by 404, it was lost. Between plague and disaster in battle, no longer could the Athenians win at all, and the Spartans utterly defeated the Athenians. Athens had too much of defeat and too much of death between plague and war, and democracy fell yet again. And this led to a brief period called the Rule of the 30 Tyrants. And more blood was in the streets, as these 30 tyrants ruled and executed as they saw fit. But again, this was a brief period because in 403, democracy was restored yet again. But this time only because Sparta, who was really running things at a distance, said, sure, go ahead, have your little democracy. Athens was no longer a threat. So democracy more or less kept going. But then in 399, something else of note happened, perhaps best characterized as yet another failure of democracy. The philosopher Socrates was convicted in trial by a jury of 500 people. He was brought up on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety. But really, it's that he used to know Alcibiades, and the people got tired of him ticking them off by always asking them questions. Asking them questions about virtue so that they could be better versions of themselves. The people got sick of it, and so they convicted him. And how annoying was Socrates? He was so annoying that 40 people on his jury who said he was innocent said, screw it, let's kill him anyway. A man who had done no direct harm to them, only annoyed them so that they might be better. Now here's some of the key historical points that we want to look at, but there's one last one. In 376, Plato wrote a book called The Republic. And that's exactly where we want to turn now. So we have two figures that we've picked up from this history besides Pericles and Thucydides. We have Plato and Socrates, two philosophers. As I mentioned, in 399, Socrates was tried, convicted, and executed. Here he is at his execution. Plato, his most famous student, regarded this as an abject failure of democracy. All Socrates wanted to do was to ask people questions because he took that to be his divine mission in order to show them that they didn't know what they thought they knew, but rather that they were ignorant of the most important things in life, like what is virtue and how to live a good life. For this, the Athenians, using the democratic process of trial by jury, executed Socrates. Plato regarded this as an abject failure of democracy. So much so that 23 years later, Plato writes this book, The Republic, and delivers a scathing rebuke of democracy. Now, this book, The Republic, isn't just about what's wrong with democracy. It's about a lot of different things, including questions of why should I be just? It has in it perhaps one of the most famous passages in Western literature, the allegory of the cave, a story that has been played with and reimagined so many times in books and films and literature. But we'll focus here on what many take to be the central project of the book, developing an ideal republic, an ideal city-state that is perfectly just. Now, one thing to note, Plato himself never directly speaks in the book. It's not a long discourse. Like almost everything that we have of Plato's, it's a dialogue with people speaking to each other, conversing, exploring ideas in conversation. The main character in the book is Socrates, though almost certainly this was not a conversation that Socrates himself ever actually had. Socrates here has become a character, a mouthpiece for Plato to speak through. Now we'll jump into this at Book 8, toward the end of the book, where Plato has developed 5 different regimes, 5 different kinds of constitutions that a city-state could have. The first, and the one that the characters have spent most of the book developing and laying out as the ideal city-state, is a kind of aristocracy, literally the rule by the best. But the aristocracy in this regime is not the aristocracy that we often imagine. Rather, the rulers in this aristocracy were philosopher kings, the wisest individuals in the city-state who most knew what is just and what needs to be done for the well-being of the city. And these are folks that are prevented from owning any property, so there's never any chance for them to rule out of a desire for wealth. The next regime is called a timocracy, and the rulers here are honor-loving warriors. Next, there's an oligarchy, and who rules here but the rich, the few rich people. Next is a democracy, and this is ruled by the people, or the masses. And lastly, there is tyranny, which is ruled by the demagogue, or the tyrant. And the idea that Plato explores in Book 8 is that each of these regimes is a denigrated version of the one above it. They tell a story of decay, of how the best form of government can continually keep decaying to the one below it. The point where we want to jump in is this question of how does democracy devolve into tyranny? At this point, Socrates says, so isn't a democracy's insatiable desire for what it defines as the good also what destroys it? The person that this fictional Socrates is speaking to is Adeimantus, who says, what do you think it does define as the good? Socrates responds, freedom. For surely, in a democratic city, that is what you would hear described as its finest possession, and as what makes it the only place worth living in for someone who is naturally free. Socrates continues, as I was about to say then, isn't it the insatiable desire for this good and the neglect of other things that changes this constitution and prepares it to need a dictatorship? Adeimantus responds, how does it do that? Socrates responds, I suppose it is when a democratic city, a thirst for freedom, happens to get bad cupbearers for its leaders and gets drunk by drinking more than it should of unmixed wine. Then, if the rulers are not very gentle and do not provide plenty of freedom, it punishes them and accuses them of being oligarchs. Yes, that is what it does. It showers with abuse those who obey the rulers as voluntary slaves and non-entities. But both in public and in private, it praises and honors rulers who are like subjects, and subjects who are like rulers. And isn't it inevitable in such a city that freedom should spread everywhere? But what comes next? Socrates says, in fact, excessive action in one direction usually sets up a great reaction in the opposite direction. This happens in seasons, in plants, in bodies, and particularly in constitutions. Extreme freedom can't be expected to lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether in a private individual or a city. Then I don't suppose that tyranny evolves from any constitution other than democracy. The most severe and cruel slavery from the utmost freedom. To explain why, Socrates says, let's divide a democratic city into 3 parts. And here I'll summarize slightly. First, he says, this class is the dominant one. Its fiercest members do all the talking and acting, while the rest settle near the speaker's platform and buzz, and refuse to tolerate the opposition of another speaker. This class manages everything. So here we have a class of leaders, the political powerful. And note the word buzz there. Plato, through Socrates, is introducing a bee metaphor. There are the leaders at the top of this group that do the talking and acting, and then there are all the worker drone bees that buzz around. Then there's the second class, everybody who is trying to make money. And the important ones here are those who do. So the rich, the wealthy are our second class. Lastly, the people. Those who work with their hands are the third class. They take no part in politics. They are the largest and most powerful class in a democracy. Adeimantus says, but they aren't willing to assemble often unless they get a share of the honey. Note the bee metaphor again. Socrates says, and they always do get a share, though the leaders, in taking the wealth of the rich and distributing it to the people, keep a greater part for themselves. And I suppose those whose wealth is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people. And they're accused by the drones of plotting against the people and of being oligarchs, even if they have no desire for revolution at all. So, in the end, when they see the people trying to harm them, they truly do become oligarchs. The people act as they do because they are ignorant and are deceived by the drones. Now, aren't the people always in the habit of setting up one man as their special champion, nurturing him and making him great? And it's clear that when a tyrant arises, this special leadership is the sole root from which he sprouts. Then doesn't the same happen with the leader of the people who dominates a docile mob? He brings someone on trial on false charges. He banishes some, kills others, and drops hints to the people about cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. Now there was a lot in there. Let's review first. We have the leaders, we have the rich, and we have the people. And the people are the biggest class. But part of the problem, Plato says, with democracy is that the people don't pay attention. They're ignorant. They really don't want to do that much with politics. They want what they think of as theirs, but they don't easily assemble. As Plato describes the people, the masses, they are ignorant of what is good for them. They turn from one passion, one appetite, one desire to another on a whim, without rational reason to guide them. And that is the very problem, letting people who, as Plato sees them, have no idea what's good for them, and jump from whim to whim, from desire to desire without reason. That is the inherent problem in democracy. That is what allowed Alcibiades to gain power. That is what allowed democracy to fail twice. That is what allowed democracy to execute Socrates. The fact that power can be turned so easily because the people can be directed from passion to passion so easily. That is the root problem with democracy, according to Plato, and what can lead to tyranny. At some point, a demagogue arises, a person who appeals to the people's passions. Not to their reasons, but to their passions. And in so doing is the person, the champion, who will protect their freedoms. But in this rise to power, the demagogue becomes a tyrant, and democracy ceases to exist. The free people become slaves to the rule of the tyrant. Now, in this fall of democracy to tyranny, there was a lot of talking. I don't mean Socrates and Adeimantus were talking a lot. The description of the process involved lots of talking. There wasn't much mention of armies, but there was a lot of talking. Let's review. The leaders talked a lot. They talk and they act, and the lower ones, the drones, they buzz. And they prevent others from speaking. Anyone who would potentially direct the masses in some other direction, no, they're not allowed to speak. And they accuse the wealthy of plotting revolution. Because remember, the leaders have had to take some wealth from the rich to give the people their share. The wealthy don't like it. And so the leaders accuse the wealthy of plotting revolution. The rich, though, they respond, they defend themselves with words. They make their appeal to the people of why they're not really trying to foment revolution. As these two groups fight, the tyrant emerges, and the tyrant talks too. The tyrant is a demagogue because the tyrant claims to be the champion of the people and uses emotion and irrational means to sway them so that the tyrant gains power. The tyrant then makes false charges against people and whispers of debt cancellation. There's lots of talking going on here. And this is what leads us to the last part of the talk today, propaganda. A lot, if not all, of the talking that was going on in that fall from democracy to tyranny was propaganda. And Plato is one of the first people to clearly articulate the problem of propaganda for democracy. But we want to look at it as well from the work of Jason Stanley, a philosopher at Yale who wrote this book in 2015, How Propaganda Works. He's particularly concerned with many of the same problems that Plato was. Propaganda in democratic societies. Now that said, Stanley is not an enemy of democracy like Plato clearly was. Plato proposed an alternate form of government instead. Stanley sees democracy as flawed, but still the best game in town. The important thing about this book as well is that Stanley, in focusing on propaganda, is the first philosopher in some time to actually develop an account of what propaganda is, instead of just referencing it, trying to figure out what propaganda is, and as the book title says, how does it work? He's brought a renewed interest and focus on this kind of speech act. So let's look at what he has to say. Stanley, very early on, notes that there's a problem of propaganda in democratic societies, and it goes back to Plato, to what we just saw, and he summarizes it this way. A certain form of propaganda, associated with demagogues, poses an existential threat to liberal democracy. The nature of liberal democracy prevents propagandistic statements from being banned, since among the liberties it permits is the freedom of speech. But since humans have characteristic rational weaknesses and are susceptible to flattery and manipulation, allowing propaganda has a high likelihood of leading to tyranny and hence to the end of liberal democracy. This is the propaganda problem for democracy. If democracies are going to be places with freedom, then by definition they seemingly cannot ban propaganda. And democracy, by definition, is rule by the people. But on the idea, at least of Plato, the people are rationally weak. They are not guided primarily by reason, but rather by passion, by desire, and those can easily be changed. They can be manipulated. Propaganda is very good at that manipulation. So the argument says propaganda is a threat to democracy itself. Propaganda can easily destroy liberal democracy. Now that more or less just summarizes the same point that we just saw from Plato. Stanley wants to carry it a little bit farther and analyze the problem further and understand what propaganda is and how it does that in more detail. Now, a few things to note about how Stanley understands propaganda. First, he says, for reasons we won't go into, that it does not actually have to be false. Sometimes propaganda are falsehoods or even outright lies, but that's not required by definition. And it also doesn't have to be made insincerely. Someone can deliver propaganda that they themselves do not believe in, but there can be plenty of very sincere propaganda. Now, he defines political propaganda this way: a kind of speech that fundamentally involves political, economic, aesthetic, or rational ideals mobilized for a political purpose. That mention of ideals is key for his conception of propaganda. Propaganda appeals to our ideals about how things should be, what in our best we are. Propaganda appeals to these, and to some degree can exploit them, as we'll see. But Stanley wants to say that propaganda isn't necessarily antithetical to democracy. As he puts it, the liberal democratic vocabulary is often used propagandistically in states whose practices fall too short of its ideals. Democratic societies have ideals of freedom, of equality, of liberty, and statements that are made appealing to those ideals do function as propaganda. And Stanley is saying here that such propaganda does have an important use in democratic societies. Sometimes democratic societies fail to live up to those ideals. It can happen. Democracies aren't always, by definition, perfect versions of what they should be. In such a democracy, we can use appeals to these ideals to call us to be better versions of our collective democratic selves. That is a form of propaganda. But such uses of propaganda are not always for the best, not always for the good. As he continues on to say, to maintain stability, the propagandistic use of the liberal democratic ideals will be required to cover up the significant gap between ideals and reality. In other words, what he's saying here, propaganda in a democratic society can be used to call us to fix our problems or hide our problems. The latter form is a mechanism for maintaining stability of the society. When we forget there are problems, the society is more stable. If the people are distracted and forget that there are gaps between the democratic ideals and the reality of their particular democratic society, then they are less likely to overthrow the government. They are less likely to install a tyrant. To summarize this idea, Stanley says failures of democracy could be hidden by the propagandistic use of the very vocabulary of liberalism. In other words, propaganda can function two very different ways in democratic society. Propaganda, he says, is in the service of either supporting or eroding ideals. Propaganda appeals to ideals, how we think things at their best should be. But in that appeal, the propaganda either supports it, makes the ideal stronger, or it erodes the ideal, weakens it. Stanley says this is the distinction between supporting and undermining propaganda. Supporting propaganda, he defines this way: a contribution to public discourse that is presented as an embodiment of certain ideals, yet is of a kind that tends to increase the realization of those very ideals by either emotional or other non-rational means. Now, that last part of the definition of supporting propaganda is important. Supporting propaganda does support the ideals it appeals to, but how does it do it? It does it not by rational argument, not by appeal to reason, but rather by appeal to emotion. And that is what makes the supporting propaganda propaganda. The problem with propaganda isn't necessarily the ideal that's being appealed to, but rather the means by which it is appealed to and is either supported or eroded, that it's emotional or non-rational. But supporting propaganda at least encourages along, helps out, helps realize the ideal it's appealing to. So you can guess what the opposite of this is, what undermining propaganda is. Stanley defines it as a contribution to public discourse that is presented as an embodiment of certain ideals, yet is of a kind that tends to erode those very ideals. So the problem Stanley characterizes this way. The problem in democratic societies lies in figuring out which apparently non-propagandistic claims are in fact propaganda. This is in contrast with totalitarian regimes, for instance, where they literally have a ministry of propaganda, and your challenge is instead to figure out which propaganda claims might actually be true. It's obvious it's propaganda. In democratic societies, the challenge is different. It's not obvious what is the propaganda. And the second problem is figuring out which kind of propaganda it is. Is it supporting or is it undermining? Because it makes a big difference. So let's talk about that acceptable kind of propaganda, the supporting propaganda. We may not want to go so far as saying they're good propaganda. They are, after all, non-rational appeals. But Stanley thinks that they do some important work in democratic society. He says, there is a kind of unproblematic and indeed necessary form of propaganda. The reason it is necessary is that it is necessary to employ when there are undemocratic features of a state that need to be addressed. In other words, what he's focusing on here is the fact that no democracy is perfect. We will always have shortcomings in a democratic society. But an important point about a democratic society is that we are, or at least should be, trying to identify the ways that we fail to live up to those, and then fix that. And supporting propaganda can serve an important role in doing exactly that. If people are rationally weak and not always swayed by the rational argument of how we need to fix a problem in order to have a better democratic society, but they are more open to emotional appeals, then it could be okay, it could be acceptable to use such appeals, such flattery as is needed to appeal to the ideals of a democratic society, to appeal to the ideals of freedom, of equality, in order to get the people to focus on how we need to further those goals. That could be acceptable. But there is a very problematic kind of propaganda, though. Stanley gives several examples. Here we'll go with his seventh. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois published the book Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. In it, Du Bois challenges the then prevailing view, exemplified by the Columbia School of historians John Burgess and William Dunning, that the end of Reconstruction was brought about by incapacity of freed black citizens to govern themselves. Du Bois' alternative account of the failure of Reconstruction is that white economic elites exploited the racism of poor whites to prevent poor whites and newly freed blacks from joining together in a labor movement with unified class interests. Though it took several decades, the accuracy of Du Bois' account of why Reconstruction came to an end has long since been widely acknowledged. At the time, Du Bois' correct reading was disregarded in favor of a manifestly racist interpretation. In the final chapter of the book, Du Bois argues that Burgess and Dunning's view undermines history by twisting its ideals of truth and narrative accuracy to the service of dominance and power. The chapter is called The Propaganda of History. This is a short reconstruction of some very problematic propaganda that was going on. Racist propaganda that was being employed in history to explain a particular phenomenon. Why did Reconstruction end in the United States when it did? The racist answer, the racist propaganda that was brought to bear on that question, gave a racist answer. And in so doing, it undermined the democratic ideals of truth, narrative accuracy, of equality, and of liberty, but it was still propaganda. It claimed to further democracy, to explain how our democracy has worked and what has happened in it, but it did so in a way that appealed to some particular ideals, some very racist ideals, and in so doing undermined the democratic ideals of equality and liberty. This kind of propaganda, Stanley is saying, is problematic. It undermines democracy. It is a threat to the stability of democracy. But that's not the worst of it. The kind of propaganda, Stanley says, that is the most threatening to liberal democracy is a species of undermining propaganda we may call demagoguery. Demagoguery takes the form of undermining propaganda that is presented as embodying worthy political ideals. The propaganda of the Chicago School was not demagoguery. Demagoguery is when it appeals to worthy political ideals of freedom, of liberty, of equality, but it actually undermines those very values at the same time that it appeals to them. Stanley defines undermining demagoguery this way: a contribution to public discourse that is presented as an embodiment of a worthy political, economic, or rational ideal, but is in the service of a goal that tends to undermine that very ideal. And here's the kicker. An audience who shares the speaker's flawed ideology would not recognize that the message is demagogic. Just because you don't recognize something as propaganda doesn't mean that it is. Undermining propaganda, demagogic propaganda, is defined in part by its effect. Does it undermine those important ideals that are central to, that are fundamental to, that are necessary for democracy? This kind of propaganda is what allows the demagogue to grow powerful, to become the tyrant. And those who support the demagogue, who are swayed by the demagogue's emotional or non-rational appeals, will not see the demagogue's propaganda for what it is. That is part of what makes it so dangerous, Stanley is saying. So lastly, then, let's summarize. What's the point? Well, we can summarize the point of talking about plague, Plato, and propaganda this way. Plato's point is that democracy allows for demagogic propaganda. This is a problem. It's hard for it to not to. And what can allow the rise of the tyrant? Stanley's point is further. It says that in democracy, it's hard to distinguish between strengthening propaganda and undermining propaganda. It's an important distinction, but it can be hard to tell the difference. To this, I want to add that we could sort of think of democracy, if we continue along these lines, as a sort of Faustian bargain. It's not just that democracy allows this kind of strengthening propaganda, rather that it needs it. If a democratic society always has flaws that could be fixed, always has faults, ways that it fails to live up to its own ideals, and the people cannot be swayed by rational argument to fix those, but can only be swayed through propaganda, then democracy needs, it must have strengthening propaganda in order to solve those problems. But there's the catch of this Faustian bargain. This allows for and even encourages undermining and even demagogic propaganda at the same time. And if Stanley is right that these two are hard to distinguish, then democracy has a fundamental problem with stability. And if we, unlike Plato, want a stable democracy, then we must be cognizant of the use of propaganda and the misuse of propaganda. And lastly, why talk about plague? Well, in short, because if the last 6 months have taught me anything, is that plague makes everything worse. The plague takes the problems of propaganda in a democratic society and ups the ante. It makes the problems that much worse. In a plague, it is harder to use propaganda to hide a democracy's failures, to live up to its ideals. Why? Because the plague has made those harder to ignore. It has exploited them at times. It has shown where the inequalities lie. When there is a plague, there is an even greater need for strengthening propaganda, to refocus the people on the common ideal, to keep the society going. Plagues stress societies. Plagues stress democratic societies. And when that happens, there is a need for strengthening propaganda to recall everyone to the goals of democracy, to the goals of equality and liberty. But the thing is, these calls, this propaganda is less effective now. In ancient Athens, in part it was because Pericles, the great propagandist, died. Plague can also make strengthening propaganda less effective because everyone is dealing with the death and the disease. It's harder to have your emotions swayed in the face of that. Propaganda is not reason-based, but emotion, non-rational based. And if people's emotions are distracted through the plague, the strengthening propaganda will be less effective, though needed all the more. And lastly, plague creates the opportunity for yet more undermining propaganda. It makes it that much easier for a demagogue to step in and make appeals to ideals that actually erode those ideals that democracy needs to survive. And that is how it can fall to tyrants. It's that allowed democracy to fall not once, but twice in Plato's lifetime, and fail a third time when it executed Socrates. So here's my parting question to you all. What propaganda do you hear? For democracy to have hope, for democracy to work, we must listen, and we must note what speech is propaganda, and what kind is it, and how dangerous is it? These are my parting questions to you.